I want to talk about patriotism. I want to construct an idea tonight with you. And then number two, I want us to talk about, in light of that, how we're going to approach the subject of history and historical leaders. We're going to start with the idea of patriotism. Let's talk about patriotism. How are we going to break this idea down? Well, you always want to go to primary sources, okay? What do I mean by that? I remember the chaplain for the United States Senate, Chaplain Barry Black, said this. He said this to me I interviewed him about 15 years ago, and then I heard him restate it about 5 years ago. But he said this. He said, it's better to read 3 pages of Aristotle than 300 pages about Aristotle. In other words, it's always better to go to a primary source. And so if we're going to live in this country, then we want to look at some primary sources that have to do with our country and the formation of our country, which of course takes us to the Declaration of Independence. Now I want us to spend a few minutes tonight on the first. We can't unpack the entire thing, but there are a handful of ideas that inform our understanding of patriotism in the first 158 words of the Declaration of Independence. We're going to look at that tonight. We're going to look at that with this end in mind. What does it look like to create an ethic for being a patriot? And of course, as Christians, we're answering that question from a different angle. We understand that question in the fact that we have dual citizenship. We're, as Philippians 1:26-28 teaches us, we are citizens of heaven, but we're also citizens temporarily of this earth, and which means in most of our cases in this room, we're citizens in this country. So what does it look like to live under the banner of calling? And so we're going to look at a primary document, but we're going to construct some ideas that we can then challenge through a biblical lens. Because ultimately, that's what we have to filter, of course, things through. I've already mentioned Aristotle, but Aristotle's rhetoric is where these 3 ideas were codified first in our early documents, and that is the idea of pathos and logos and ethos. And when we talk about ethos and logos and pathos, there's 3 things I want you to understand, and we get this from Aristotle's rhetoric. It's 3 strategies to establish authority or to understand credibility for a culture. And so when we talk about pathos, we're talking about emotional appeal. Logos, we're talking about logic and reason. But ethos is where we get our idea of ethics from. It's where we get our ethical appeal or the sense of credibility. It's a spirit of a culture, if you will. And so what I would like to do is look at a handful of sentences from this document, and then I'd like for us to extract a handful of ideas to construct kind of an ethic of how to be a patriot. We're going to apply some of the same disciplines that we use for the art of interpretation, which is called hermeneutics, is a fancy way of saying that. And hermeneutics is not just used for the Bible, but it's how we would study ancient documents and interpret them. Of course, in Christianity and preaching and pastoring, we apply that, if you will, to the Word of God. We're going to take those same techniques and we're going to apply that to a document that really informed the creation of this country, if you will. Let's define a couple of terms first. The first is the word patriotism, which comes from the root word father. Patriotism is a zeal or enthusiasm for one's fatherland or one's country of adoption. Now listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. Patriotism comes down to this. It is a desire and a belief in the best version of one's country. They say that a different way. It is a desire and a belief, and even a passion for the best version of one's country. One of my favorite characters in recent history is a guy by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a lot of things. He was a church planter, he was a theologian, he was a scholar, he was a lot of different things. He was a Lutheran minister, but he lived in Germany during the time of the rise of the Third Reich. And then was ultimately part of he was a spy. He was the only pastor in this group. Most of them were military strategists, others were businessmen, but he was the only minister in an underground group that sought to basically destroy Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. In fact, he was part of 2 failed assassination attempts. If you've ever seen, there's a certain movie that Tom Cruise did about a failed uprising against the Third Reich, and it's fairly accurate, but the beginning of the movie starts with a bomb being delivered to where Adolf Hitler was going to visit some of his military leaders, and he flew in, then he flew out, he had a meal with them, and he flew right back out. Well, in the movie starts with a bomb being delivered and secretly snuck on the plane, and it never exploded. And it didn't explode because the temperature, when the plane got to a certain height, and it was a bomb where ink was released, and it was supposed to be timed, but they didn't take into consideration that the low temperature would slow things down and actually bring the bomb to a halt, and it would never explode. Well, most people don't understand that bomb was delivered in a vehicle driven by a pastor. And he didn't even own a car. He had to borrow his dad's car that night. Didn't tell his dad why. He's part of this underground movement, and he wanted to protect his family from certain death if they would have been. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer would ultimately pay the ultimate price and would be hung and killed in a concentration camp, literally a handful of weeks before the fall of Berlin. One of his central arguments for his militant stance against the Third Reich and Hitler was patriotism. He believed that the vision for Germany that was being proposed was not the best vision for his country. And so he appealed to a more noble vision, right, wrong, or indifferent. I'm not saying you have to agree with the guy, but right, wrong, or indifferent, he was motivated by a love for the fatherland and the best version of the fatherland. And so that led him to some pretty extreme stances and actions. When we talk about patriotism, this is a very serious thing. And there are people who have paid the ultimate price for what is best for their country. That's obviously a very extreme example. The second word is where we get our word ethic from, which obviously we've already talked about, but speaks to character. It represents the ethical character of an individual, also represents the ethical character of a society in some cases. And so we want to put these two words together and go, okay, what's an ethic of patriotism that we can live by, if you will? Let's look at the first handful of sentences in one of our founding documents. We hold these truths. These are amazing words, probably the most magical words in the last 250 plus years, 300 years. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, most people know that line. That's the most memorable line. That's the most quotable line. The next several lines, though, are going to contain about 5 more ideas that help us to unpack this idea of patriotism. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. See, that's not the most quotable part, if you will. And to institute a new government, laying down its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, the word prudence simply means patience. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established, of course, obviously, the government that was being established at this time was being born and conceived. So it was a very young government. Will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes. And accordingly, all experiences has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. All right, let's get ready to rock and roll. 6 ideas. First of all, an ethic of patriotism is informed by obvious and understandable truths. We make that conclusion based on Jefferson's words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, they are understandable. if it can't be understood by the common man, then it has not been clearly explained. Years ago, I used to get a little wordy, still do. And I had somebody who was critiquing, and I do this every year, and I think good healthy communicators should, and they just got to you just got to take your medicine. I'll have somebody just kind of totally dismantle and critique what I'm doing every year and speak into it. And I had somebody say, hey, if you can't explain it on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, then you don't know it well enough. In other words, if you can't communicate it simply, then it's not known to you, much less is it going to be known to the person you're trying to communicate it to. And so Jefferson believed, and of course there was a 5-person team. We're going to talk about this in just a moment. There's a 5-person team who was appointed to be authors of the Declaration of the Independence. Everybody in history knows that Jefferson wrote the vast majority, and the others 4 primarily edited. But Jefferson, and by the way, at the age of 33, crafted the Declaration of Independence, the words that we just read. But he starts with this main idea, and it wasn't like he had already articulated this idea in earlier drafts of during a state legislature in Virginia, and some things that he had been proposing there. And so really these ideas had been, if you will, marinating in his mind for some years now. But he begins with this. Are you ready? Everything about this country you should be able to understand. Like sometimes, especially in an age of social media and an age when there's so many combating voices and an age when everybody's tearing down everybody else's idea, and it can seem so complicated that it's beyond the realm of understanding. And Jefferson goes, no. And by the way, most scholars would agree that Jefferson was our most scholarly president, most philosophical president. He was not a practical guy. He was a brilliant man. He was a walking contradiction, but he was a brilliant man. And he starts off the most important document in the creation of America, if you will. He starts off with the most important document that we go back to time and time again with, what I'm about to tell you, everybody should be able to understand. So we've come to our nation's capital to understand. And what I hope you're getting a sense of, and you'll see this more and more as the days go by, is that this stuff is understandable. Don't buy into a lie or anybody that tries to tell you, oh, it's so complicated and you can't. No, you can understand what it means to be a patriot of this country. And so an ethic of patriotism is informed by things that are understandable. They are obvious and understandable truths. Number 2, patriotism is grounded in equality of all persons. Of course, we get that from the statement, that all men are created equal. I would encourage you to look at this statement. Now, by the way, Jefferson, and so many people like to argue this, when people are a big walking contradiction, and Jefferson was, a guy named Joseph Ellis wrote a book called American Sphinx, and he said trying to study Jefferson is like walking into a room where there's 100 ongoing conversations at the same time. Like there's a lot about his life that contradicts itself. No historian that I've read that I deeply respect would go, yes, he's a strong evangelical Christian. No, he would quote scripture, and then he would say things that were against scripture. He would say one thing, he would say another thing. He was constantly wrestling, even to the end of his life. And yet, he sneaks into the founding document one of the most sacred ideas that we would end up fighting wars about. And it is the equality of all men. I want you to write a phrase down, the sanctity of human life. And students, I want to challenge you to understand the meaning of that phrase. And can I encourage you? Here would be my starting point. Don't dumb down this phrase just to mean anti-abortion. Like, listen, I celebrated, and by the way, we should celebrate the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That's a big deal. But our argument for being pro-life, as it is often quoted, is stronger when it is grounded in a bigger idea that has to do with the sanctity of human life, which speaks to the equality of all men and women, born and unborn, young and old. Because there is a plethora of issues that you will have to wrestle to the ground that have to do with the value, the infinite value of human life. Understand this, the sanctity of human life begins with the understanding that every human being is an image bearer. That everybody, I love this phrase, Dr. Bill Brown taught me this phrase years ago, that every human being is infinitely valuable, is forever important in the mind of God. And he stamps them so by making them in the image of God. So patriotism has to be grounded in the understanding of the equality of all persons, that all men are created equal. When you visit the Civil Rights Monument, and we see the MLK Monument, which is one of the newer monuments in this city, one of the great quotes there is that the quality, not the longevity of one's life, is what is important. Let me say that a different way, guys. You're not valuable because of what you can offer. You're valuable because you were created in the image of God. And in a society that esteems beauty and esteems talent and should we try to be good at what we do and better at what we do and present ourselves well? Of course. But never fall prey to the lie that your only value is discovered in what you could bring to the table. You don't get to value. You start off valuable as a human being. You don't climb the mountain of value. No, you're already born stamped infinitely valuable. It's a big idea that oftentimes gets lost so easily. Number 3, our patriotism is motivated by the understanding of divine blessing, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Our patriotism, as well as our freedom, is a blessing. Please write that down. This is a blessing. And please write down that a blessing by its very definition is undeserved, if you didn't get that down earlier. You can't really define a blessing isn't a blessing if you deserve it. If you deserve it, it's an entitlement. A blessing by its very definition is something you don't deserve. The fact that you and I are given the divine blessing of being a citizen of this country falls under another theological category. Please write this down, called common grace. It's not a theological aspect that we talk about all that much, but common grace has to do with the graces of God, the blessings of God that are bestowed upon us that really don't have anything to do with our salvation. It's how God, it's how God will go, yeah, I can make it rain on the good and the evil. Like the fact that we have government is a blessing. Doesn't always feel that way, but it's a blessing. The fact that we have laws, we have protection, and we have the fact that we have a medical system, the fact that we have education in this country, the fact that these all would fall under the larger category of common grace or a divine blessing. God has chosen to bless. Now, I know immediately some of us are going, but why does he bless some and not bless others? Can I just be honest with you? Look at me. I've spent the better part of 25 years studying this stuff. You ready? I don't know. I do know this. Those who understand blessing realize they're supposed to be a blessing to others, though. And a blessing that is treated like an entitlement will evaporate instantly. If you treat a blessing like an entitlement, there's nothing that where God will just go, well, I'll just keep blessing. Even though they're going to be entitled, I'll just keep blessing them. There's consequence. Patriotism, number 4, is guided by the highest ideals of what a nation should aspire to be. That among these, Jefferson would write, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's turn those into 3 questions. Please write this down for me. How would you turn this idea of being guided by the highest ideals into application? Well, is life protected and valued? Number 1, write that down. Is life protected and valued? Is life protected and valued? Number 2, is freedom guarded and granted? Is freedom guarded and granted. And then the third question, based on the word happiness, is happiness, and here it is happiness possible and probable? A healthy society should not just be a society where happiness is possible. A healthy society should be a society where happiness is probable for its citizens. So is happiness, is it not only possible, is there potential of it, but is there a pathway to it? Number 5, patriots seek to hold their country accountable to the better version of itself. This is where it gets a little sticky. This is where Jefferson would write, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people, pretty big words, to alter it. That's not that big of a word. To abolish it, that's kind of a big statement. And to institute a new government. Students, listen to me very closely. A good citizen, and this is your responsibility, is to hold America accountable to the promises that it made. That's not anti-patriotism. That's part of what it means to be a patriot. Is to hold this society that you and I are blessed to live in, to hold it accountable to the promises that it has made. Now, Jefferson would warn that you don't just try to overturn governments left and right. So he's going to come on the heels of this statement with a calming statement. But this statement right here gives way for citizens of a country to speak out loud against its own government. I think that's called democracy. And there's a lot of places around the world where you're not privileged to do that. There's a lot of places around the world where we even hint at that. It leads to certain death or at least jail. I'm going to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm quick to recognize that we've got a long way to go and there's some challenges that we have in this country. But I think we should also be pretty quick to recognize that, man, compared to some other places, thank God that I live here. But because I live here, I have a responsibility. And that responsibility is to speak out. That's part of what it means to be part of a democracy. So it's okay to protest. But listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. If your protest doesn't lead other people to the feet of Jesus, it wasn't a gospel-centered protest to begin with. This is what should lead us to a healthier understanding of justice. Guys, that phrase has gotten co-opted in our culture in just the last 5 to 7 years. I used the phrase social justice in the title of my dissertation in one of the most conservative seminaries in this country. You couldn't get by with that anymore because it's such a disputed phrase. It has been co-opted to mean something very liberal even. But justice is a reflection of the character of God lived out in culture. It should be one of the most biblical acts that we do is to care about the character of God being reflected in the values of the culture in which you and I live. So listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. When you go to college, don't let some professor who has no clue what they're talking about tell you that if you want to care about justice, then you have to fit into this camp. Because justice has been a big part of the history of the church. And we find that even in our founding document. You have the right to speak out against wrongs. You have the right to correct your government. You have the responsibility to do it, actually. Number 6, this is where Jefferson now goes, all right, everybody, calm down just a little bit here. To be a patriot is to be patient with his or her government. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes. The word transient, please write this down, means lasting only for a short time. Lasting only for a short time. In other words, the older a society grows, the more wise it should become. It should become. Oftentimes, the more sluggish it is to change. How do you become patient with your country? It's one of the hardest things sometimes to do as we're growing and we're going through these different stages, this stage of the journey. I want you to write down a handful of ideas on how you can stay patient with your country. Number one, serve. Serve those who are less fortunate than you. Serve those who don't experience all the blessings that you experience. Be willing to serve. Whatever door of opportunity that may be. That may mean that you volunteer in a crisis pregnancy center in your hometown. That may mean that you go visit. Can I tell you one of the most under-visited places in most of our cities is what's oftentimes referred to as a nursing home. It means that you go care about people who are in the last stages of their life and their family members stop by twice a year. I don't know, but find a way to serve where you live. It is really hard to be impatient when you have a servant mindset. Number two, honor. I think the second key to being patient with your country is to honor. Honor those who have sacrificed. I've taught my children always to say thank you when they see somebody in uniforms, when we're maybe going through an airport or something like that. I remember the first time my son, Gabriel, got up the courage to do this. He was 5 years old, and he got up the courage to do it because I said, go do it. You don't have a choice. And we were sitting in a terminal in Atlanta, B terminal in Atlanta, and waiting on our flight to take out. I've spent half my life in the Atlanta airport. I've lost my salvation a few times there as well. But we were sitting there and waiting on our flight, and we had about 45 minutes, and there was a gentleman who was in full uniform sitting 2 rows over from us waiting for the boarding time to start. I said, Gabriel, go over there and tell him thank you for his service. So he got his courage up and he walked over there and he said, hey, sir, thank you for your service. And he turned around to walk away, and the soldier's like, hold on, buddy, hold on. Hey, thank you for telling me that. He said, I want to give you something. And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out just a simple pen. And that pen was a symbol of the branch of service that he was in, and it had a little statement on it, and then there was something personalized just about his unit on it as well, because that's a long-standing tradition. Gabriel's 18. That was a long time ago. He still has that pen. And every time he looks at it, I hope he's grateful. And he's reminded to honor those. I don't want to, listen to me. I think we should be very patient with people who are struggling with brokenness. And we have a lot of sexual ethics issues in this country. I think last count that I saw, there's 56 different categories for how to identify yourself on Facebook. That's a lot. It is a sad state of affairs, and I'm not being impatient with those who are struggling, because there's some of us in this room that are struggling. But it's a sad state of affairs when a country will dedicate more time to expressing sexuality than caring about those who put their life on the line to protect our freedoms. Honor those who have served. Never be ashamed of that. The third characteristic, I think, or the trait you need to have to be patient with your country is to pray. Let me encourage you to pray for those that it's not convenient to pray about or for. Why? Because it's obedience. You and I don't have a choice about this stuff, guys. You don't just pray for the guy that you want elected or the gal that you want elected. You pray for the people that are in power. And your willingness to pray for people that even you disagree with is a reflection, like we said earlier, of your view of God. It's a reflection that you trust the scriptures and you believe that there's leaders that have been appointed and under God's sovereignty, like that God can somehow hit a straight line with the most crooked of sticks. Don't just pray when it's convenient or when it feels good. Make it a spiritual discipline to pray for your country's leaders, no matter who they are, whether you disagree with them or not, whether they played for your team or the other side. Pray. Pray for your state officials. We always like to talk about the national level, and then we stop there. Pray for your state officials. Pray for your local officials. Like, what if our houses of worship, Jesus said it should also be a house of prayer. What if our churches became places that we even prayed for people who were serving on the local school board? You think that would have an impact on our cities? You think we'd be a little bit more patient with what's going on around us? Long-suffering? Have a better witness? If we were praying for those that we're not comfortable to pray for? You're going to be a patriot. You got to understand that you can get this. You got to believe in the equality of all persons. You got to understand common grace and that you've been given a blessing to be in this country. You got to be guided by the highest of ideals. You got to hold your country accountable. And you need to be patient with her as well.